Thanks for joining me. I'm Matt Finch of mechanicaldolphin.com, and I'm joined today by the Australian artist and educator Wendy Catling. She works with photography and digital media to explore issues of family history and the darkness which lingers at the heart of family life. Just before we begin, I do want to warn listeners that Wendy's work deals with issues of domestic abuse and violence, which we might discuss in the course of this recording. Wendy, it's so nice to see you. How are you today?
Hi, I'm good, thanks.
Thanks,
Matt.
Thank you so much for letting us into your studio. Right now we're in this tiny, beautiful space where a lot of your work happens. Can you describe it for the listeners?
Well, it's a former bedroom in my rambling house. Children have left home and took the opportunity to spread out a bit. Before that, I was working just in my laundry, making cyanotypes. But now in this room, I've got benches and pin boards with all of my digital work printed and sort of there displayed while I kind of think about arrangements of things and what's working and what's not. And I've got notes up from my research into weeds and weed behaviours and psychopathy traits, affects from affect theory, and I've got an etching press in here. There's quite a lot squeezed in this little room. A scanner, a printer, a desktop computer, storage, and a lovely view out to the garden.
Ideal, isn't it?
It's a nice place to work.
Absolutely. It's a step up from the laundry room, I can imagine.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that term cyanotypes, that you were working on cyanotypes in the laundry room. Can you tell us a bit about what that process is and what it produces?
Cyanotypes are quite an old technology. From the very, very early days of photography. They were invented by Sir John Herschel and taken up by photographers mainly as a way of making cheap proofs before they went on to the more expensive process of silver gelatin printing. But the daughter of one of John Herschel's friends got interested in cyanotypes. Her name was Anna Atkins, and she's famous for producing what's known as the first photo book.
Right.
And that was a series of imprints she made of algae. She was British.
Right.
So it was the history of British algae. I can't exactly remember the title now, but she, like many Victorian women, so this was in the 1850s, it was sort of a lady's hobby to collect algae at a time when women weren't allowed into the sciences. So for many of them, it became more than just a hobby, but actually a scientific pursuit, and it certainly was for Anna Atkins. So she did a very comprehensive study of algae and documented them by placing the algae onto glass, and underneath the glass was placed a piece of paper that was coated with cyanotype chemistry, and cyanotype chemistry reacts to UV light, so it just needed to be exposed in sunlight and then washed off in water and dried in a dark room, and she created these really beautiful images.
Brilliant. And I can see you have a pinboard behind you where you're working with a huge range of images in these cyanotype colours. And
yeah, but they're digital images.
And
yeah.
One of the things I understand is that cyanotype is it actually the same process when we think of architectural blueprints, like when you see them in old movies and cartoons?
True.
Blueprinting is the cyanotype process as well.
That's what it evolved to, yes. It never really became an art form or a kind of a legitimate expression of photography. There were pockets of people using it, but it actually was more commonly used as a cheap way of making a copy of an architectural drawing or design.
Right. And as you say now, the digital images that you use now share this kind of deep blue colour.
Yeah, I've become very attached to that blue. I'll probably abandon it at some point, and not all of the images I'm making currently are in that kind of monochrome dark Prussian blue.
Mm-hmm.
But for me it has an emotional effect.
Yes.
That ties in with my study of affect theory, but it has a very strong sense of melancholy. And I should point out that the type of blue that I'm using is quite different to the cyanotype blue that Anna Atkins got with her work. The quality of blue with cyanotype changes depending on the type of paper that's used, but I've been very attracted to the deepest, darkest version of that blue, and it's to me it has many links and associations, I suppose, with darkness and the use of blue in cinematography to denote nighttime. It also links with things like blue movies and there's a whole range of personal associations as well.
Yes. When was your first encounter with that photographic process or with that colour? When did you start to think this is something that I'm really going to spend some years excavating and playing with?
I suppose, well, I've worked for many years as a teacher of photography, and I teach darkroom and digital, and really loved photograms and teach photogram work with younger students in the darkroom. That's using silver gelatin photo paper and just making an image on it by placing an object on the paper and blocking the light of an enlarger. So it just leaves a sort of ghostly white impression in a dark background. So I was doing similar things with cyanotypes, and I guess my first discovery of cyanotype was doing a professional development workshop, and it sounded simple and interesting, and I just fell in love with the colour blue. And so it was a very similar process to the photogram process, but with blue instead of black.
Oh, lovely. And you've talked about the fact that you've moved into using more digital tools and technologies, but something that came up when we started talking this week was you mentioned you have a freezer full of nightshade berries,
yes,
which also play a part in your artwork. So tell me how nightshade came to be a part of the mix.
It's sort of a long story, I suppose, because it dates back to my first project in 2015, in which I explored a personal family history through cyanotypes. And for this current project, I've taken leave from teaching, and I've gone back to university to do a Masters of Photography, and I wanted to expand my practice. So I've expanded, I take lots of digital photographs, but I hadn't used digital photography in an exhibition before. And so I've actually expanded not just into digital photography, but also installation and film, which we might talk about later. But the personal history was still a strong motivation for me making work. And I was thinking about my mother's experience as a woman whose partner was violent. And that was what I grew up with, domestic violence. And just thinking about my mum she's 89 now, and a strong woman with a wonderful life who endured 20 years of this very difficult marriage. And one of the things that's been a continuous, I suppose, an activity that's kept her sane and kept her strong, and it's been a passion, and that's been working with plants. As a young woman, she was a farmer, working alongside her father on the family farm, and then during her marriage to my father, she was always a very keen gardener.
Right.
And not just plants, not just flowers, but fruits and vegetables, and then in her more recent years, perhaps for the last 25 years, she's worked with local environmental groups, preserving native bushland. And part of that is pulling weeds out of native bushland, because weeds are the kinds of plants, sometimes they come from another part of Australia, sometimes they come from overseas, and the behaviour that makes them a weed is that they're very aggressive and
Right.
predatory and opportunistic and these kinds of things. And I started to see a relationship between those behaviours of weeds and the kinds of men who target perhaps vulnerable women and seek to control them.
Right.
And so weeds became that kind of motif, that dominant motif in my project. And getting back to your question about berries in the freezer, I've been collecting weeds, for a whole variety of them and studying them. And the one weed that kind of leapt out was the nightshade, which we do find in pockets around this area of Melbourne, amongst many other weeds. But it just seemed to have qualities that reminded me of my father, being an attractive plant that's often mistaken for something that's not a weed. It can be poisonous, but it can also be edible. So it can be dangerous, but also the opposite to that.
Yeah.
So it had all of these things that a kind of complexity, I suppose, that helped me to think about the complexities of domestic violence. And the berries that the nightshade produces, when they're ripe, they're a very dark colour, and they produce this juice that I've discovered is a really good dye. And I've been dyeing fabrics with it, and I've also been turning it into a ink and writing with it. So that I'm still developing those techniques, but they're becoming a part of my project.
It reminds me of some of the first of your cyanotypes that I saw, the mention of fabrics, that you would create these images that looked like weeds under the water, and it would be lace or netting in this deep blue space.
Yeah.
And we've alluded to this idea of kind of a inky, watery darkness, and alluded to family histories and those tensions. You grew up in a lakeside town near the New South Wales-Victoria border, is that right?
That's right, yeah. Yarrawonga.
Yarrawonga. Tell us a little bit about your memories of the lake. What was the childhood by the lake like?
Wonderful and terrible, actually. It was, it's a beautiful place. It was a place where lots of people from other towns and from Melbourne went for their holidays. It's a place of all sorts of water-based activities: fishing, swimming, water skiing, sailing, rowing. Quite a very hot climate in the summertime. The lake was lined with lawns and willow trees, so it was a really lovely place to be. But I also have these enduring memories of learning to swim in the lake and swimming in the water, and it's not like your crystal clear swimming pool or the sea. The water was always quite murky, and it was hard to see below the surface, and there were water weeds and slime on the bottom and sometimes leeches, and I was a nervous swimmer, so I have those other negative memories of learning to swim and hating the sensations beneath the surface of the water.
Yeah. Was it different being in Yarrawonga in the off season compared to the high season? If it was a town that people visited as tourists or for the weekends, was there a noticeable seasonal change?
Yes, yeah, much quieter. Yeah. The town probably doubled or tripled in size during the summer school holidays, and we would have visits from relatives, our cousins and so on, and they were really fun times. Yeah, and then in the off season it was just sort of a normal kind of sleepy country town.
Yeah.
With the farming industry probably being the main employer outside of the town.
Wool or arable farming?
No, crops.
Crops, yeah.
Yeah.
And you've mentioned also growing up your mother looking after the garden, fruits and vegetables coming from the garden as well. How many of you were there living together in the house?
In Yarrawonga, I had 3 brothers, myself and parents, and my grandfather lived with us as well. That was his house. Yeah. I have a sister who came along later.
One of the things I noticed is that in your work you blend this reflection of the natural world and this exploration of colour with family histories and archive photographs and elements and incidents from the story you want to tell about your family history.
Yeah.
What process did you go through in terms of getting hold of family photos and checking the stories behind them? What's been the process of talking to siblings and your mother? How's that gone?
Well, I started with family photographs that I had in my personal possession, and then felt that I needed more photographs of my father, for instance. I've been kind of zooming in to archival photos and cropping to just sort of small sections of them, in particular hands. And my mum has been, I've been sort of talking with her throughout the whole process, and she was looking through her collection of photos and finding things for me. And then I reached out to brothers and sister, and there's a bit of discomfort from my brothers who prefer not to look back to the past, which is their right, and I respect that. And my sister is on board, but she was born much later, so she doesn't really have much. So I think I've explored as much archival material as I'm going to get access to now.
Yeah. Have you found that sometimes even with the same photograph or the same incident, that people have very different versions of that when you talk as a family?
Yeah, it's interesting. Memory is not a fixed thing, and even years ago when my mother's memory was better, we kind of had different versions of events. That's something that doesn't bother me. I think that kind of imperfection of memory is a part of the project. So the memories that I have, or the impressions that I have, whether they're completely right or whether there are some falsities to them, is irrelevant really. It's how they've how I've kind of retained these stories and how they have affected me over time, I think. So it's come back to being, while it's a project that's about the experience of my mother, it's the experience of my mother seen through my eyes.
Right. And is that partly the fact that you're an artist as opposed to a documentarian? Is that where the difference is, that this isn't about unearthing the facts of the past?
Absolutely, yeah.
And you mentioned this term affect theory. How does that connect to this exploration?
Well, affect is it's quite a complex thing to understand, but my understanding of it is that affect comes before feelings and emotions, and it's a sort of subconscious reaction to stimuli. And just looking at my notes on the board there,
there's a long list of very emotional adjectives. Yes, there's a long list of affects.
So there's people like Guy Deleuze and many other theorists explored affect, and the affects, each of them is on a scale. So enjoyment is at the lower end of the spectrum of a scale that goes up to joy. The affects that I'm interested in are things such as shame at the lower end, going up to humiliation at the other end. Distress becomes anguish, anger becomes rage. And there's 9 in all, but they're the ones that I'm sort of thinking about most of all when I'm exploring these stories.
Yes, and you've started to draw on these tools from critical theory, but also from psychology. I know you're interested in the ways that we try and study and describe psychopathy, for example.
Yeah.
So you've reached out to people who study these fields.
Yeah, well, I started with pop culture, having an interest in true crime, and then read John Ronson's book, The Psychopath Test. And it's part of the zeitgeist, isn't it? Lots of people are really interested in the psychology behind psychopathy. So that was the starting point of my project, actually, wondering if my father's behaviour was the result of a kind of psychopathy. And what I learned was that psychopathy, again, is a spectrum, and it's only the upper end of the spectrum that are the people that you hear about who are serial killers and so on. But yeah, in trying to discover how much of a psychopath my father might have been, I did reach out to a forensic psychologist, and we talked through some of the 20 traits that are used to determine whether someone is a psychopath or not. And they come from, they're a diagnostic tool that was developed by Dr. Robert Hare in the 70s, I think. And in having that discussion with her, what she found more interesting about the few small stories that I told her was the elements of stalking in my father's behaviour, which is kind of another thing. And so I suppose that theme of psychopathy, which I was using as a conceptual framework, wasn't really working out, because while my father's perhaps on the spectrum, it's hard to diagnose someone after they've gone, and the more significant thing about his behaviour was his stalking and his sort of jealousy, which led to stalking. But it was a really interesting discussion, and I still partly part of my sort of in the background of my thinking when I'm developing my images.
Yes, strangely it makes me think of Anna Atkins's work sitting at the boundary of art and science, that she's collecting algae.
Yeah.
And you're also integrating psychology, different photographic practices, and quite personal family stories as well.
It's as we talk about at university, the project is complex and layered, and it's it's still ongoing. I'm still developing it, and I see it continuing on and perhaps going in different directions after my master's is finished.
And alongside the personal images and items from family albums, that you integrate images from the archive as well, I understand. What work have you done in the archives? What have you found there? How do you blend that into your artworks?
Do you mean external to family albums?
Yes.
Only personal archival material. So my mother had a collection of newspaper clippings, for example, which I found very interesting. For example, there's a story in her local newspaper about the journey she took to Europe when she was in her early 20s, and this is how she ended up meeting my father. He was English. Not that she met him over there, but via friendships she made when she was there. And it was just kind of amusing but also saddening to read, the letter that she wrote home to her parents about what an amazing time she was having in England, and she was there for the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. And a letter home to your parents is newsworthy enough in those days, in the 1950s, to be published in the local newspaper. I thought that was really, really interesting and kind of poignant. And there are some of the airmail letters that she wrote home to her parents that I've been looking at as well. And if there's that link again with blueness, they were written on blue onion skin paper.
Right. This is the age of airmail. It was lighter, or what?
Yes. Yeah, it was lighter because you had to pay by weight.
Right.
In those days. Also, I found an old Brownie annual that I had as a child, and there was an article in there about weeding. So I've rephotographed that, and it's the associations and these kinds of objects that cause resonance that I hope may create a resonance for an audience as well.
Yes. And you speak about your mother there as a writer, and not just as a writer of letters, but those letters then being republished in the newspaper. And earlier we talked about the idea of using those nightshade berries not just to dye material, but also as ink.
Yeah.
I know you're interested in the links between art practice and creative writing, or creative writing as a part of your art practice. So you're also writing alongside these photographs?
Yes, I'm in some cases responding to photographs in writing, and telling the stories through my taking myself back to being a child and the memories that I have of particular incidents, but also cutting into those with quotes from my mother's remembered incidents. So I conducted some interviews with my mother, and she so I've told some of the stories through her words as well as through my childhood memories. And then also I was looking at books that I remember my father reading in the 60s and the 70s, and I remember he had Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, and so I purchased a copy of that online, just thinking I'll just photograph the cover and that might be another object, as you know, part of a sequence of objects that relate to my father. But I started reading it and realizing that that kind of thinking that Dale Carnegie was promoting, that he claims, you know, people wanted to know about, not just how to make friends, but how to influence friends, was very much a part of the I suppose the times, you know, that in the book was first published in the late 1930s, but it became really popular in the 60s, and he used to run seminars which were also hugely popular. And although the 1960s was a time of great social revolution, it was still a very patriarchal time. You know, it was a time when people cared about making money and influencing others in terms of business relationships. And you know, that was sort of the conservative side of society that we forget about. You know, there was the age of Aquarius and hippies and so on, but there was still this other half of the world, and you know, families and you know, women expected to stay home and look after children, and husbands, you know, being the breadwinners and the ones who were out there influencing others. Right. So it's I've still got some reading to do in that particular book. It's revealing all sorts of things about the way people thought during the 1960s, and you know, I was just kind of surprised to realise that while some things did change, and it was, you know, those times were the beginning of a whole social revolution, there's, you know, we never really got rid of some aspects of conservative thinking.
Yes, I can imagine. Thinking about Yarrawonga, did the counterculture come to this lakeside country town in any sense? Were you aware of those changes going on?
I was aware of the Vietnam War during the when I was at primary school in the 60s, because a good friend of mine, her uncle was quite a young man and he went off to the Vietnam War. So I kind of vaguely knew about that, and later on in the 70s had older friends who had been conscientious objectors. The other aspect of counterculture, the other aspects, you know, in terms of drugs and sexuality and so on, I was completely unaware of. But I do know that after I left in 1970, Yarrawonga had a major music festival. So obviously, you know, the older generation were certainly very aware of it. I was just a bit too young.
Sure. And so, as you say, the aspect of the 60s that came to the fore was this slightly more conservative side in your dad's reading of Dale Carnegie.
In my personal experience, yeah.
And it's very much, you mentioned this idea of the nightshade being this charming looking plant, which is also aggressive. And I suppose the dark side of Dale Carnegie is the idea of imposing one's will through charm on other people.
Yes, yeah.
Interesting. But you yourself, in terms of your own practice as a reader and a writer, when we were talking before this interview, you mentioned figures where writing intersects with photography, like Teju Cole, W.G. Sebald, the artist Sophie Calle in her storytelling aspect of her work, and Paul Auster, the novelist. What's in that kind of literary artwork that you respond to?
I guess the reflecting back on the past and the meaning that has for you, and I guess the kind of symbolic significance of things that are remembered. So it's none of us remembers everything. We remember things in our own way, and I'm just interested in what I have continued to remember all these years and what I've forgotten. And so I kind of have a memory that is more prone to remembering the traumatic events. And I guess from other reading that I'm doing into domestic violence, that's a common thing with children and women who have been exposed to domestic violence, that those events, because of the trauma, continue in your life as memories. It's links with PTSD. I did read in a book by Jess Hill that it's a book that's called See What You Made Me Do, and she did some research quite extensive research into domestic violence through personal stories and court cases and the legal system, that those who have been exposed in some way to domestic violence, more than just PTSD, have a complex form of PTSD, because it's a trauma that it links with a person that you've trusted for a long time, and also because it's ongoing over a long period of time rather than being just one sudden event. So getting back to the authors that I'm interested in, they explore those kinds of memories, and just, the other aspect is just I really enjoy their writing style.
Yeah. Are you sensing your own writing developing? Are you someone who has always been a writer, or are you an artist who is discovering herself as a writer now?
I wouldn't say I'm discovering myself as a writer. I haven't always been a writer. I've always been a reader. I've been a great reader since very young. My writing over the last 20 years has only been in terms of education and curriculum. But when I took the time off this year, I started writing a lot in my journal, which I was using for my just kind of day-to-day reminders for my masters, but I started writing notes and ideas into it, and that kind of expanded. And then we have done a creative writing unit this past semester, and I guess these stories have always been in the back of my mind, and so I really revelled, I suppose, in the opportunity to put them down on paper and the opportunity to explore different ways of expressing them, because for example, I wrote a story about my father building a small yacht and us sailing it on the lake, and it was just my next youngest brother, my father and myself. My youngest brother and I were very, very young, so I don't have a really clear memory of the actual physical events on the yacht. I just remember it being traumatic because my dad got angry. So part of that story was memory, and part of it kind of just impressions and creative fictionalizing, I suppose.
It sounds like, though, that creative writing is a really useful tool in this regard, because you're interested in affect and the things that underpin even emotions.
Yes.
There are things that can't be reconstructed in the way that the police would or a scientist would, but you can reconstruct the emotion or the affect underpinning it.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm it's not possible anyway, but I'm avoiding taking a documentary approach to this family history and really just focusing on those feelings, those moods, those undercurrents.
Something that always interests me talking with artists or writers of performers or any kind is the notion of a relationship to the audience. So for a performer, that's often very real and immediate. And I know you have some experience in improv and performance and having that live connection. In the kind of work you're doing now, how much do you think about the audience and what you want them to get out of an encounter with what you're making?
Oh, I think a lot about the audience, but there's only so far I can go because I can't predict how people will respond to this work. Part of my study of the theoretical side of things has been looking at reparative aesthetics, which comes out of affect theory, and it's where artists who are telling stories take an interest in not just the victim, but also we're talking about traumatic stories, not just the victim, but also the perpetrator, perhaps the bystanders as well, and the witnesses. So in this particular project, as the child of a family where domestic violence happened, I'm both a witness and a victim. But I'm also looking closely at my father, not just as this kind of nebulous monster, but as a human being and as someone who experienced trauma in his own childhood. Perhaps that led to him being the person that he was, and that idea of it being a cyclical thing that needs to be stopped. I'm also considering and including references to bystanders. In my mother's day, in the 1960s, people didn't talk about what was happening behind closed doors. And in fact, there are all sorts of barriers to talking about it. Things like divorce being difficult, doctors and police being unsympathetic or just not wanting to get involved. So those are the kinds of bystanders who could have done something but didn't for various reasons. So it's I'm trying not to make a project that just points at the appalling behaviour of the kind of monstrous psychopathic elements of domestic abusers, but the complexities to those stories, through looking closely at that in my personal history.
And it really seems to me that over the past year or two, and especially starting postgraduate study, that you're on a master's degree at which university now?
It's Photography Studies College in Melbourne.
And it's given you this real time to think through the theoretical tools you use, to think through your family history and your technique. I remember when I first saw your artwork, it was definitely figurative, and there were representations of lakes and weeds in the lakes, and you could see there were objects, but the story had not yet fully emerged from the depths. What has it given you, this opportunity to take on postgraduate study and move away from full-time work? What has it done for you as an artist?
The thinking time is the main thing. When you're teaching, it's very, very full on. Long hours and all pervading of your creative space. I may go back to teaching. In fact, I'm sort of scheduled to go back to my full-time job, and I think having this time off will definitely enhance and inform my teaching. I think it's a really wonderful opportunity that all art teachers in particular should have, perhaps other subjects as well, exposure to more time to develop their personal passions, relating to what they teach. But also on a sort of personal level, it's, I went through some time towards the end of that period of teaching before I took time off, where I was feeling more and more frustrated at giving creatively to others and not having time to pursue my own creative thoughts. So it's having that space in my head and the just seemed like an incredibly long period of time, 18 months, but now I realise that I'm going to be anxious to continue on after that 18 months isn't that long at all. So it's been amazing.
Do you find, in addition to having the time to actively ferret into things and read and dig deeper, you actually notice things differently when you're let off the hook in this way?
Yeah. Well, I've, for example, looking at family photos, I hadn't really looked that closely at them before, but now I'm sort of looking so closely in relation to the stories of my mother that I'm able to kind of pick out things that have a meaning beyond just that documentation of an event. Things like gestures in particular have really leapt out at me. The way that people hold their hands and what that might mean. A wedding photo, for example, where the bride, my mother, one hand is being held by my father in a kind of, I guess in a way that is proprietorial, and her other hand is being held by her mother in a way that is tender and perhaps reluctant to give her away. I hope that other people will see that as well. So I've zoomed in and just been cropping into those kinds of gestures, and I would never have had the time to see that without taking this time off and really spending time looking at things closely.
And as we draw towards the close of this discussion, let's think about that, about your mother's hands. That one of the most striking images I've seen of your work is quite a recent close-up of your mother's hands while she's working as a bush care volunteer.
Yeah.
And I can sense alongside the darkness of some of this family history, there's also the fact that she's growing these fruits and vegetables for you in your childhood, that she herself, I've been lucky enough to meet her on one occasion, she's a very strong and charming person. And tell me about where she's at now and the work she's doing in bush care and what those hands are doing as she approaches her 90s.
Yeah. Well, she lives independently. She's very fit for her age, amazingly fit. She plays golf and sings in a choir. And she's living a wonderful life and very involved in the lives of her grandchildren as well. But this bush care work, it's an organisation that she was a founder member of her local suburban bush care, but there are bush care groups in other parts of Australia, and they go to sort of suburban preserved bush areas, and we have quite a lot around here in the outer eastern suburbs of Melbourne, and they regularly go in and pull out environmental weeds that would threaten the native plant life in these preserved areas. So it's something that a group of people do once a month or sometimes more often as a voluntary thing. And I think it started, the history of these groups began in the 1970s in Sydney with a couple of women called the Bradley Sisters, and it's spread to other parts of Australia since then. I was reading a book on 1950s design recently, and it spoke about how in the 1950s there were certain professional gardeners who started to develop a love of Australian native plants. Up until then, and even now, many gardeners only plant European plants in their gardens. But that was the beginning, the 1950s, of an interest in Australian flora, and it has spread fairly slowly, but there are a lot more people who buy native plants, and we even now have specialised nurseries that sell incredible Australian plants, and there's the Australia Garden in Cranbourne where you can go to get ideas and buy plants. So it's a growing phenomenon, but also, even from the inner city of Melbourne and coming out to the outer suburbs, there are these green belts along creeks and the Yarra River where it's now recognised that the foreign species are causing damage to what is beautiful Australian habitat. And so it's a growing movement. But Mum got involved back in the 70s, just after she broke up with my father for the last time, and he passed away not long after that. And it's been something that she absolutely enjoyed and helped her make long-lasting friendships as well. So it's been really amazing for her.
And how has it been for her working with you on your art project? What's been her take on that?
She's quite bemused by it all. She, for a start, she hates being photographed. So that's been, I have taken portrait photographs, but I felt that her resistance to that was probably a good thing in the end, because it made me think more creatively about ways to represent someone through a portrait, rather than just the traditional means. She's read some of my writing recently, and one of the lovely things that she said was that, because I was concerned about how my brothers might react to these personal stories being told, and my mother might react to her stories being published, and she said, it's your story. Don't worry about what, I fully support you. It's your story and you should tell it.
Well, wonderful, Mum. Good.
Yeah, it's been great.
I've been mindful not to ask you to retell any or many of the stories associated with this project, because the stories are really being told through the art itself.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, we have touched on some of these themes and issues, and if anyone listening is affected by the issues raised, are there sensible places for them to go to get in touch? We can include links in the description to this video, of course.
Yeah.
But is there any way that you can suggest directing people towards?
I've started volunteering with an organisation called Macaulay Community Services for Women, and they're a wonderful organisation that provides shelter for women and children who are escaping family violence. As with, there are many other charities as well, and all of them struggle for financial support in order to provide the resources that are needed. But they do have great shelters and can provide support in other ways for women who need assistance to escape family violence. So look for those.
We'll include some
There'll be
material
others,
in the link as well, of course.
Yeah.
And I know people can find out a bit more about you and your work at ettamodern.com, ETTA modern.com, but they can go there to find out about what you're up to now and what you've been up to in the past. Where do you think you'd like to go next with your art? Is it possible to look ahead?
I think, as I was saying earlier, this project doesn't end when the Masters ends. And because of my new involvement as a volunteer with organisations who are helping women and children, I'm hoping that I could develop some kind of community arts project. I'm already talking with Macaulay about doing just crafty, arty summer workshops for kids, but there might be something sort of a more public, socially aware project that I might be able to develop. So that's sort of where I'm looking. I don't really have any clear ideas yet, and of course it would always have to be very sensitive to the security of people who find themselves in this situation. But that's something I'm really keen to look into further.
Brilliant. An absolute last question. This work you're currently on, when will people expect to see it exhibited? What's the timescale for us to see this work in a gallery or another space?
I'm showing for assessment in June or July 2020, but there may be potential for the work to be shown in galleries after that. I'll be looking for those kinds of opportunities, perhaps a touring show, or just parts of the work being shown in other galleries.
Thanks. It's really one of the most moving, thoughtful, empathetic, complex bodies of work that I've seen. I'm really, as you know, a huge fan of your work, and you're one of the few artists whose work I've ever bought.
Thank you, Matt.
So I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time to talk today. I hope that everyone listening has also learned a lot and gained a great deal from hearing you speak about your work. Wendy Catling of etamodern.com, thank you so much for your time, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, a pleasure.